You won't believe what I asked my gardener to do with me one quiet afternoon, something that completely changed our lives forever. If you've ever felt lonely or misunderstood, you'll want to hear this. It wasn't just a favor. It was a request that came from the heart. And what happened after, well, it's something I still think about to this day. Neither of us expected what came next. I'm Helen, and I've lived in this house for many years. My husband, Charles, and I built our life here, in this quiet suburban neighborhood, where every corner of our home holds a memory. Charles was my everything, my partner, my best friend. For nearly 50 years, we shared a life full of laughter, travel, and dreams. We made this house our own, creating a world that was just for us. Charles was the love of my life, a man of charm, wit, and unwavering devotion. He was a history professor, always buried in books about ancient civilizations. His passion for the past became mine too, and we'd often spend hours discussing history as if we had lived through it ourselves. He had a way of making the world seem more interesting, more connected. His presence was my anchor, and for so many years, I couldn't imagine life without him. Charles was also deeply committed to our family, always finding little ways to surprise me. Whether it was a handwritten note tucked into my favorite book or a spontaneous picnic in our garden on a summer afternoon, he never stopped showing me how much he cared. Even after our daughter moved abroad, leaving us to navigate life on our own, Charles and I grew closer, relying on each other more than ever. But life, as it tends to, threw us a curveball. In his later years, Charles became ill with a degenerative disease, and watching him change was the hardest thing I've ever done. Despite the pain, I stood by him, caring for him through the slow decline. Our love was what held us both together in those final years. It gave me strength, even as I watched him fade away. When Charles passed, it left an irreplaceable void in my life. This house, which once echoed with his laughter and his presence, felt eerily quiet, as if it had lost its purpose. I would sit here in the stillness, in a space that once felt full of life, and feel completely alone. Funny how a place can change when the person you love is no longer there, isn't it? That's when Tom came into my life. He wasn't much younger than my daughter, but there was something about him, something steady and kind. He wasn't just my gardener. He was a quiet presence, someone to talk to, someone who listened. He brought a little bit of company back into my life, especially when the silence in this house became too much to bear. But one day, something inside me shifted. I wasn't sure why, but I wanted something more, something different. For so long, I'd been living in the quiet, in the routine of tending to the garden and reflecting on the life Charles and I had built together. But it wasn't enough anymore. I had a feeling that Tom, in some strange way, could give me what I was missing. He had a presence about him that I couldn't quite put into words. And before I knew it, I found myself standing in the garden, the words slipping out of my mouth before I could even stop them. I asked him to do something that none of us could have ever predicted. You might think I'm crazy, or maybe even desperate, but sometimes, when you've lived as long as I have, you realize that life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just keeps moving, keeps pulling you along. And sometimes, you have to take chances, even if they don't make sense at first. So, I asked Tom to spend more time with me. Not as my gardener, but as a friend. As a companion. There was something in the way he looked at me, something that made me feel like I wasn't invisible anymore. I needed someone to talk to, someone who wasn't afraid to listen, someone who could help fill the silence that had settled so heavily over my life. I could tell he wasn't expecting it. But he didn't refuse. And that's when things started to change. What happened next? Well, I don't think either of us were prepared for it. Tom was hesitant at first. I could see it in the way he looked at me, uncertain, almost as if he were trying to decipher the true meaning behind my words. I knew, deep down, that what I was asking wasn't something that could easily be understood. I wasn't sure why I was asking it, but something about that afternoon, the weight of silence, made me crave something more. Something beyond the quiet of my house, beyond the garden that I had tended for years, beyond the loneliness that had settled into the corners of my soul. And so, without really thinking about it, I asked. And when he said yes, a strange sense of relief washed over me. We spent hours together, talking about everything and nothing. It felt good to hear another voice in the house, to feel the air shift with the sound of someone else's laughter. Tom wasn't just a gardener. He wasn't just there to trim the hedges or mow the lawn. He was someone who listened, someone who seemed to understand without judgment. As we spoke, I found myself telling him about Charles, how we used to sit in this very spot, under the shade of the old oak tree, talking about our future. I hadn't realized how much I missed those simple conversations until I started sharing them with Tom. There was something about him, something that made the quiet moments seem less heavy, less oppressive. He listened with kindness, and the way he looked at me made me feel seen, really seen, for the first time in ages. I found myself speaking more freely, my words flowing faster than I'd ever intended. The years of silence seemed to unravel with each conversation, and with it, the walls I'd built around my own heart began to crack. And then, the music began to play. It was one of Charles's favorite records, a piece we used to listen to when we wanted to escape the world for a while. It had always been a symbol of the calm we shared, the warmth of our love. But now, as the notes filled the room, it felt like something different, something heavier. My heart ached with longing, with a need for connection that had only grown since Charles's death. The quiet yearning that had lived in me for so long now felt like a roaring wave, and suddenly, I wasn't sure I could control it. I looked at Tom, unsure of what I was about to do, but unable to stop myself. "Would you dance with me?" I asked, the words hanging in the air between us. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, I thought he would refuse. But then, without hesitation, he stood up and offered me his hand. I felt my pulse quicken as I placed my hand in his. There was a spark there, something unspoken, something that made my chest tighten with anticipation. We danced. And in that moment, it wasn't just about the music. It wasn't just about two people swaying together in a living room. It was about the space between us, the closeness we shared that had nothing to do with age, or boundaries, or what was appropriate. It was about desire, the kind of desire I hadn't felt in so long. A craving for intimacy, for warmth, for connection that went deeper than the casual conversations we'd had up until then. As we danced, I could feel the heat of his body close to mine, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a widow. I didn't feel like a woman carrying the weight of a past I could never go back to. I felt alive. The scent of him, the way his hands rested lightly on my back, sent a ripple of warmth through me. It wasn't just the music anymore. It was the way his touch made my skin tingle. The way his eyes met mine, not with pity, but with something else, a kind of understanding, a kind of hunger that mirrored my own. The room felt smaller now, the space between us shrinking with every beat of the music. I wanted more. My body craved more. And though I knew it was wrong, though I knew it was complicated, I couldn't stop the desire that surged through me. I had spent so many years hiding from my own needs, my own desires, convinced that my life was meant to be quiet, reserved, and full of memories. But in that moment, everything shifted. I could feel his breath on my neck, and I wanted him. I wanted something I hadn't let myself want in years, a connection that wasn't just about grief or memory, but about living, about feeling. But as quickly as the moment intensified, it seemed to dissipate. Tom pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine, as though he could sense the shift in the air. My heart raced, unsure of what was happening, but suddenly aware that everything had changed. What had started as a dance had become something else, something unspoken, but undeniable. I didn't know where this would lead, or if it should even go anywhere at all. But in that moment, I realized that the longing I had buried for so long wasn't something I could ignore anymore. And neither could Tom. That evening, something inside me shifted in a way I never expected. It wasn't the kind of revelation you see in the movies, dramatic and clear-cut. No, it was quieter, subtle, almost imperceptible. But it was powerful. The loneliness I'd carried for so long didn't just vanish, like I thought it might, but it softened. For the first time in years, I wasn't just the grieving widow anymore. I was Helen. The woman who still had the capacity to feel joy, to experience connection, to even entertain the possibility of love again. I hadn't realized how much I had buried under the weight of grief until that moment, until that dance. I had convinced myself that my life was meant to be filled with quiet resignation, a life marked by memories of a man I could never have again. But that night, with Tom, I realized something I hadn't let myself consider. I was still capable of feeling. Capable of desiring. Capable of finding something beautiful and meaningful, even in my years of loss. Tom wasn't just my gardener anymore. He had become something more, something I hadn't known I needed. He was my lifeline in a way I never expected. A simple kindness, a shared moment, and a dance turned into something much more significant. It wasn't just about him being there for me, it was about him showing me that I was still here, too. Still alive. Still a woman with desires, with needs, with the ability to connect. What he gave me that evening. I can't even put it into words. It wasn't the touch or the closeness. It wasn't the physicality of the moment. It was something deeper, something quieter. He reminded me of the beauty of human connection. He showed me, in the gentlest way, that I could still be a part of this world, that I could still step out of the shadows of my grief and rediscover what it meant to be human. To be seen. To be valued. And that meant everything. The evening eventually came to an end, and Tom left, but not before I made sure to tell him just how grateful I was. I don't think he truly understood the full depth of what he had done for me that night, but what he gave me wasn't just a momentary distraction, it was something deeper, something far more lasting. It was peace. The kind of peace that comes from realizing you're not as invisible as you sometimes feel. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone anymore. I stood there in the quiet of my home, the same house that had once echoed with the laughter of a life lived with Charles. But now, there was something different in the air, something lighter. Maybe it was the music still lingering in the background, or maybe it was just the way my heart felt a little fuller. Whatever it was a reminder that even after all these years of living through loss, of living through grief, there was still a way forward. That night changed me in a way I never expected. It reminded me that no matter how old you are, it's never too late to find comfort, to feel human connection, and to be seen. We all carry our scars, our baggage, and our broken hearts, but sometimes it only takes a small moment, a simple act of kindness, to open the door to healing. I had spent so long thinking that I had nothing left to give, nothing left to offer. But Tom, with his patience, his kindness, and his simple presence, showed me that wasn't true. There's always room for more. There's always room for growth, for new connections, for new beginnings, even when you think the chapters of your life are already written. And for that, I'll be forever grateful. If you've ever felt like there was no one to turn to, or like you were lost in your own loneliness, let this be a reminder, we're all just looking for a connection. And sometimes, the most surprising people come into our lives when we least expect them to. We might not always recognize it in the moment, but those unexpected connections can be the ones that change everything. I hope my story has shown you that it's never too late to rediscover what it feels like to be seen, to feel understood. The world can sometimes feel overwhelming and isolating, but there's always room for more love, more laughter, more connections, even when we think we've reached the end of our journey. If you enjoyed hearing my story, and if you believe in the power of those surprising connections, I'd love for you to stick around. There's so much more to come, and I promise you won't want to miss it. More stories, more moments that will remind you just how incredible life can be, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. So, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe, and join me for more stories that will touch your heart and keep you coming back for more. Thank you again for spending this time with me. I'll see you in the next one.